Welcome back to Train the Trainers. This is session 3 out of 6. Looking forward to working with those of you who are here live. For anybody looking at the recorded version afterwards, please feel free to contact me if you have questions about it, but it should be self-explanatory. The one thing you should note about the recording is there will be pauses when we're doing exercises where the learners involved in the live session are preparing things, and I'm not going to make you sit through the process of watching them do that. So the recording will be slightly shorter than the live version. And with that said, I want to dive into today the third part by, as usual, telling you a story to set the tone for this. This particular story talks about the idea of how we prepare ourselves most adequately to be great presenters and how we interact with our learners in ways that kind of surprise them and make it comfortable for them. Story I'm thinking of is something I saw in an urban library setting many years ago. The training issue to be met there was the for lack of a better word, the insecurity that the security guards are feeling around certain library patrons. Some of them were struggling with an issue involving transgender patrons. And that was the issue of people coming up to them and saying, hey, there's a man in the women's restroom. What are you going to do about it? And the guards were not at all comfortable or prepared to deal with that for a variety of reasons. So they asked for a good, well-directed, interactive training session that would help them address the issues, get more comfortable with what was there, and more effectively do their work. The answer in that situation was to bring in a trainer who really knew a lot about diversity and knew a lot about making people feel comfortable in different settings. So we put in this person who, for purposes of this story, so we're not outing anybody in any way, I'll call the person Fernando and say that Fernando was brought in to talk to the security guards, work through the issues and make them more comfortable with the conflicts that they were feeling for themselves and the conflicts they were having to resolve beyond anything they expected when they got hired as security guards. So Fernando did a little bit of upfront work, determined what some of the issues were. The day of the session shows up, is there for an hour, starts off the session just talking at a general level of working with people that may be different from you or have different feelings from you or react to situations differently than you react. And that's fine. The guards, a really wonderful group of people, by the way, were easing up, easing into that training and getting to trust Fernando at the level where they could open up about some of the issues they were having. So then Fernando started moving into some of the more specific issues about it, like the legal protections that any patron, including a transgender patron, has when they come into a public building, and started setting a context for that and helping them more through the issue of how they deal with these people without thinking of it in terms of this person has this label, that person has that label. Finally, it came to the point where Fernando said to the group, all right, so where are you really concerned? And he didn't quite use this terminology. It's terminology I generally have tried consistently to use with you. The real heart of the question was, where is your pain point? What are you struggling with? And that opened up a very frank conversation for those people that were actually uncomfortable with patrons who were transgender, or at whatever stage of the transition that they were trying to make. And the visual cues they would give off, the verbal cues they would give off, and what the guards had to deal with up front. And it was very effective by the end of the session when Fernando was saying, so do you have what you need? And are you comfortable with this? And the guards pretty much said, yeah, we're ready to go. And we really appreciate all that you did for us. He says, any other questions? And somebody actually popped a question. How do you know so much about this? And how are you so good at doing this? And Fernando said, because I'm transgender too. I made the transition from female to male. And that was the first moment in that 60-minute session that anybody understood that this was actually coming from the heart of that particular trainer, because Fernando had experienced that and knew what it was like and knew the reactions that people got, which opened up again the most magnificent follow-up conversation. He says, any questions you have about that procedure, that process, ask me in the context of what you need to know to work, and we'll answer that. The real stunning moment for me was when the evaluations came back. The evaluations, when I was allowed to look at those, showed that not only did every person who responded in the evaluation rate that at the highest session they could, but they went far beyond just checking off the boxes, saying on a scale of 1 to 5, what did you feel? Was this good? Did it help? There were good, long written comments, which is what you always look for in evaluation, because that means people were passionately moved by the topic rather than checking off an evaluation because you told them they had to. And one that I will never forget is somebody said, that was life-changing. You look at a training when somebody comes back to you afterwards and says that was life-changing, and that takes you to the heart of what we do. I've said it before, and I'll plant that seed at the beginning of today's session. We are about transformation, and we are mostly about positive transformation. We are responding to a learner's needs, the pain they're feeling because they don't know something, and we are trying in the most supportive, welcoming way to make them understand that here are some options, give them those options and work with them so that when they come in, they've got their goals and objectives that they know they're supposed to meet. During the session, everything is geared toward helping people meet those. And afterwards, they're supported in the workplace so they can use effectively what was there. Those of you that have seen the recordings or been here for the live sessions in the first two know that I'm a big fan of that book that talks about the 6 disciplines of successful training. And it's that whole model of the supervisor and the employee before the training sit down and say, why are we putting you through this and what do we hope to accomplish? And in the best of situations, the manager or supervisor is in the training to see what's done. But the killer moment is afterwards when there is support in the workplace. And again, to recap what we've talked about the first couple sessions here, the research done for that particular book showed that before they instituted the system of it being a process rather than a one-time event, about 85% of the learning was not used 6 months after the training took place. After that process, with the support in place and the learners having had that wonderful moment of transformation that was supported when they went back to work, 85% of the learners going through that were still using what they learned 6 months later. And that's what we want to strive for. So let's back out of that story a little bit and think about Fernando and what that meant to be the kind of trainer that brings the experience into the room and really speaks from the heart and speaks openly and non-judgmentally as much as possible with a group of learners. And let's see where that's going to take us today. But let's start with the usual thing that we start with. Do you have any questions? And I'm going to make one change here for myself so that you have the option of either speaking by unmuting yourself or putting things into chat. I just brought my chat screen up. I want to say chat screen, but that's not where we're headed today. Do you have any questions or concerns based on what you got out of the first 2 sessions? If you do, unmute yourself. Let's talk about this. If not, feel free to put it in the chat, no questions, and we'll just move on to the next phase of this. Okay, I'm seeing no questions. And again, for those of you that are listening to recording, if this is the first of these recordings you've listened to, get ready for that idea that there will be moments of silence here. One, because I want people to have a chance to think through things. 2, I find that sometimes when you ask a question and jump in too quickly to answer it, you've cut off the possibility of that level of exchange that I want to foster in our sessions together and what you do with your own learners. I had a funny conversation with a colleague of mine yesterday. We do interviews together once every 2 weeks on a radio program he runs up in Toronto. And we, at one point, we're talking about the importance of silence in learning, that moment of reflection. And I don't know if this is true or not, but he had heard, being from Canada, that there is an FCC rule here in the United States where if you're on the radio and you go more than 5 seconds of silence, you can be fined. I said, I don't know if that's true, but boy, if that is true, I'm going to be fined forever and ever the way I run trainings and leaving those moments of silence. So those of you listening to the recordings understand it's built into this. And if I'm asking a question that I'm asking the live participants to respond to, that's an invitation to you to do the same thing. Think and respond so that you're not just passively taking this in. All right, let's do a little bit of conversation around the stuff we're talking about. The point of today's session, by the way, is to take us from what we've been talking about in terms of having assessed for a learning need and having done the design and development of that learning need so that we're at the point where we actually deliver face-to-face or online. So what we're going to talk about today is the things that make a session work, things we want to think about as we're finishing up our design and development, what we want to do to prepare for a successful session, and what makes a session lively and engaging. Now, this will be the focus. And I hope that by the time you leave today, one of the things you will have is a greater appreciation for all those little things that make for great success and a better understanding of how that affects you and what makes you comfortable when you work with that stuff. So priming the pump, number 1, we're going to do 3 quick conversations here. The first question I want to ask you is, what's one of the things you enjoy most about designing and facilitating a learning experience for others? So think about a training session. What do you really love about that moment that you're getting into the room and working with people? Anybody? Okay, Allison's already putting in sharing my knowledge. Fantastic. Anybody else? And again, let's take full advantage of the fact that we can see each other, we can hear each other. Fine to use chat if you want to do that, but please don't hesitate to unmute yourself and actually speak into this so we get the kind of conversational atmosphere online that we so much try to foster face to face. A couple other comments that have come in, Allison's saying, usually if I'm doing a training, it's something I feel some level of passion about. So important. The last thing you want to do is have somebody have you in a room as a trainer, training something that you absolutely hate, that you're uncomfortable with, because you know that's setting you and your learners up for failure. Mahasine says gaining deeper understanding is important. Victor saying the exchange of ideas. Mahasine again, okay, there was just a typo in there, so understanding. And Inga said feeling like what I'm saying is effectively communicated. So Inga, let's unmute for a second. What are some of the things you do to make sure that what you are saying is effectively communicated?
So like I'll pause and just like check in with them and kind of like inquire, ask questions and see, you know, like what I just went through them. But sometimes that's really hard too, because they'll just be like, yeah.
That's
I
right.
don't know.
Let's jump off on a little side thing and keep your mic open, because I want to ask you a couple more questions. And if anybody else wants to join in this on that same topic of how you effectively communicate and judge that. You heard me mention in week one, a colleague of mine, Sardik Love, who is a fantastic virtual presenter as well as a face-to-face presenter who's just knockout. I've known Sardik for years, and anytime we're at a conference together, if I have 10 conference choices during a big session to go to, I will always go to Sardik's, because no matter how many times I see him, I always learn something new from him. Sardik talks about the importance of what Inga was just saying. Ask questions if you want to engage people. If you ask questions and give that pause that Inga's talking about and that I'm talking about, it lets your participants, your co-conspirators in learning, understand you are sincere about this. So Inga, what are some of the other things you watch for that are not verbal that tell you whether you're reaching people or not?
It has to be eye contact. And like maybe their physical, like if they feel comfortable, like you can just sense like if they feel comfortable or not and or at ease with it.
Yeah. So here's an open question for everybody. If you're in a learning situation, you're somewhere in the room trying to help people, or you're in the virtual setting like we are today, and you're looking around and see that people are kind of going, or you can tell that they're looking at their email, or you see them knitting, or you see them using their cell phone. Is that an automatic sign to you that there is a problem? Right, Mahasine, you're nodding your head no. Why is that not
As
necessarily
somebody
a
who
problem?
had just had to talk to my daughter and look at my phone. Well, because like sometimes it's just there's circumstances outside the person's control. And so especially if it's a training that's not necessarily required and they're there, it shows an effort. So I've learned to not read too much in. I mean, you can read in sometimes, but it's not a guarantee that the person's distraction is a reflection on the content. And I think you do have to be aware of that, because I don't know if you both have the experience where you're like, oh, at a meeting, somebody's making a facial expression, and like afterwards you check in and you realize that it had nothing to do with, like, and they weren't even aware of it. So yeah, so I hope that's helpful.
That's a great point. I learned so much from watching, and it's something I keep encouraging you all to do. Sort of watch what I'm doing, take it under the hood, and anytime it's not clear to you why I'm doing something, ask, why did you do it that way instead of this way? We had what I thought was a really good transformative moment along those lines in the first session, when somebody was nice enough through private chat to say, I'm noticing something about your slide deck and I want to know why you did that. And the answer was, I hadn't noticed that, and you're making a good point. It's something I need to adapt to. Something I learned from watching great people was when I was actually in library school on site for a brief session almost a decade ago. It was an introductory course. There were about 130 of us in the room for the first couple of days of the course, and then we all went back online. But the instructor made a big point early on of saying, I'm not going to really look around and bust you if you're doing knitting, or if I see you looking at your laptop, or if I see you looking at a cell phone, because you're an adult and you're here to learn. And I'm going to assume that you're, with the best of intents, getting what you need out of the course and taking it back and using it in your own workplace or wherever you're going to go with it. Says, I learned a long time ago, great story. I learned a long time ago, again, quoting the instructor, that if somebody was knitting in my room, it wasn't because they were bored, it was a way of helping them focus. And what a great lesson. He told all of us that, kind of giving us permission to do what we needed to do, as long as we got what we needed out of the course and got the learning. Malcolm Knowles, who is somebody, if you haven't read, you do want to read. Malcolm Knowles wrote a book probably 50, 60 years ago. It's now in his 6th or 7th edition. Strangely enough, he's been dead for quite a while. People keep revising the book because it's such a wonderful book. I believe it's called Adult Learning. And Knowles talked about what makes adult learning work for all of us. That is, adults come to the learning place with a specific need that has to be met. They need to meet that now. They have their focus and they have limited amount of time to work with us. That's describing all of you, I'm assuming. And so if we assume that the adults are actually adults in the room, and we stop screaming at them if they're using their cell phone or doing their email or doing something else, we lose a lot of the time that we waste worrying about whether we have their attention, and we focus more on the actual thing of, am I meeting your needs and what more can I do? Which is why during sessions like this, I so often say, can you give me some feedback? Are you okay with this? Is there anything that you want to ask about? And draw from session to session the continuity that helps you to establish these 6 things as an overall learning experience that you're going to turn around and be using, at least by the end of this, if not already, in your workplace. Anybody else in the idea of things that really appeal to you about designing and actually delivering learning? One more person who hasn't said anything yet. Don't make me outweight you. All right, if there's nothing to add to it, then let's flip the question a little bit. What's one of the things you most dread about designing and delivering, especially that delivery, face-to-face or online? What's something that you dread about training at the delivery stage? Victor. I'm not hearing you. You've got yourself unmuted.
Better now?
It's a little bit low, but I'm hearing you better. I don't want to have you have the microphone right in your mouth. If sound's a problem, we can go back to chat, but try one more time.
What I'm
Perfect.
saying is, I guess the fact that at the last minute, once you show up to provide your material, that's not what they meant you to deliver. They wanted you to do something else, or that they completely changed the idea.
You're talking about the learners changing the idea on you?
No, not the learning, but the person that asked you to provide the training. They said, well, can we exchange it? Can we do this one thing instead of?
Unfortunately, Victor, it's just at the edge of where I'm hearing about 50% of what you're saying. Let's go back in your case to going into the chat. Just put down the essence of that. I'll read that from the chat. And I'm so sorry that that didn't work out. While Victor's doing that, anybody else want to jump in? Something that you dread about what's happening when you're in the learning experience and you're facilitating that session?
I would say like tech difficulties. Those are always really awkward and hard because you've like put all this work and energy into something, and like if in person when it would be like the projector, like like you brought it's the wrong cord and you can't get it, so you can't access your presentation. I think Zoom, it can be especially at the beginning of the pandemic, we saw or I saw this a lot. People just weren't familiar with like presenting settings, and so it's very hard to watch someone. It's like my heart goes out to watching someone, but it's even harder to be that person with the awkward silence. So for me, it's just like the mechanics of it going all wrong.
What's your go-to answer to that when your technology isn't working?
I try to remain calm, and I try to be prepared, like have a printout if necessary, or a second computer that I can look at, and then a little bit of humor, and then after, there's like a sweet spot where people are willing to wait, and then you got to move on, and so then it's just kind of working from what until it can be fixed, or giving a plan B. So
Perfect. That's, if I were doing this as a lecture format rather than trying to solicit that information as the wisdom of the crowd, word for word, that's what I would have said. So those of you that have not faced that or hadn't thought about that, think about what you just heard in terms of being ready with multiple different ways to do it and knowing what that sweet spot is as to when to move on. Nothing, in my opinion, is worse than being a learner in a room where the instructor goes to do something. Let's take an example that nobody's ever seen here. The instructor is starting off the session, they get into about the 3rd or 4th slide, and they suddenly look and say, That's not the slide deck I intended to use. We've never seen that happen, right? Nobody's ever seen that happen. What we just heard is first you take that deep breath so the neocortex doesn't shut down and we don't get more and more stressed out from it. The second thing is you just, with a sense of humor, say, well, no denying that that isn't what I expected. And the third thing is you move as quickly as you can. My rule of thumb is if it's taking you more than a minute or two, and those are very long, painful seconds in those minutes or two, if it's taking you more than a minute or two to resolve a tech problem, bail. Have a backup plan and be ready to move on. You will notice so far today, and here's the moment of revelation or the moment of reveal. Notice what we're doing today in terms of presentation style. What are you not seeing that you'd usually see in a presentation like this?
A presentation, the slide deck.
The slide deck. Do we miss it right now? Is anybody saying, oh, I wish instead of seeing everybody else in the course, I could be looking at a bunch of pretty slides? If you do feel that way, feel free to say yes. But I think that if we are engaging with each other, and if we are treating each other as co-conspirators in the room, that we can do amazing things without a deck. And yes, I did prepare a deck for today. And as you'll see, occasionally I'll glance over to see the slides that I'm not seeing up on the screen. But that also helps us define what a slide deck really is for us. Is the slide deck the presentation? Quick yes or no. Raise your hand so I can see you if you think that the slide deck is the presentation. Good. Everybody knew that. I set that up so you knew what answer I was hoping for. Are you comfortable presenting without a slide deck? Depends is a great answer. Allison, go ahead and say what depends means to you.
I think it depends for me, like on the setting, on the size of the group, on the subject matter, like a lot of different things. I use a slide deck a lot of times just to keep myself on track and to like spur my thoughts, but kind of just like as a reminder and to help me, yeah, as Mahasan said, to like visually jog my memory and frame things up. Perfect. That's exactly what I was trying to say. So it's like I kind of use it more as like notes. But if it was a smaller group on like a subject that I was like really familiar with, then I probably wouldn't actually feel the need for it. And I would probably just have like notes in front of me on a piece of paper or something. Like if it was a group where we could sit around a table and talk, or like a small room or something. But if it's like a large group, like let's say I was doing a presentation at my all staff, then I would probably want a slide deck just because then there's something for me to help frame it and help keep people on track and blah, blah, blah. So it just depends on that.
Great answer. I tend not to repeat what I think is great answers. So I'm not going to repeat what Allison just said, but great point. And one other little thing here, I noticed when Allison was making the comment she was making, that she referred to our course mate, our co-conspirator, Mahasan. And I realized, oh my God, I've done it again. I've been mispronouncing that name. This is another thing for all of us as learning facilitators. If we notice that we are doing something and someone in the room says something that inadvertently corrects us, that's part of paying attention to what's going on in the room and being sensitive to that. So I'm assuming that Allison said the name right, and that it's Mahasan instead of Mahasin, which is what I've been saying. And I see the nodding. We did that week or session one. That's been like dog years away, so I've forgotten. But these are the kind of little things that we pay attention to. And as learning facilitators, we incorporate into facilitating a session better so that they're more effective. But also when we're especially in a train the trainer thing, it's great to just say that out front so that you don't all think, oh, well, he's been doing this for years and he never makes a mistake and he's not self-conscious about this. Of course I make mistakes. Of course I'm self-conscious about this. If I found out right now about 30 minutes into this session that I had a big food splotch on my forehead, I would be mortified and I'd have to think of a joke that I could make to talk my way out of the situation and then just go on. The whole philosophy of, well, there's no denying that, so let's acknowledge it and let's move on. But everything that we're hearing now is how through conversation, not necessarily with a slide deck or any other tool, we can do this thing. We can work with our learners and encourage them. Again, I'm going to look back to see if I'm missing anything in the notes here. Mahasan said, I think a visual to help jog my memory and help frame the conversation is a purpose of the slide deck. And Allison said, I'm usually bad at remembering names, but I've been with these folks for a few months now. I mean, come on, let's be honest. The way that I can remember your names is it's Zoom. I can see your names. And unless you want to mess with me, and I'll change your names around, which is a perfectly fun thing to do if you're comfortable and the learning facilitator is comfortable with playfulness. I'm an old joke. I'm a 5-year-old at heart. You know this. Old joke. Cheryl Gould, who you all know from sessions before, when I was in one of Cheryl's sessions and a bunch of us had known each other over a few day period because it was train the trainers. All this went out, I think it was on day 3, and you'll never guess who instigated this, but we all just switched name tags on Cheryl. And it took her about 5 seconds to realize we were being mean to her and for her to come up with some kind of appropriate thing. But if you're having trouble with names, have people do something simple, especially if you're face to face. Have them take a piece of paper, fold it into a little tent card. You don't have to prepare the tent cards ahead of time yourself. And just have them put their names in front of themselves, acknowledging that you don't have a perfect memory, but you care enough to be able to address them by name and acknowledge the person behind the card and behind the face that you're looking at. These are little things that we all need to be thinking about in terms of prepping for training and actually delivering effective training. And returning to that whole idea of that question I just popped as a sub question here about what is the purpose of a slide deck? There is a wonderful TED talk out there. I'll see if I can get the link for you and send that out as part of the extra resources you can look at before the next session. But a writer, Jonathan Haidt, H-A-I-D-T, did a TED talk easily half a decade or a decade ago. And shamefully, I can't remember the full topic that was there. What I remember is how he delivered that TED talk and what was so stunningly beautiful about it. As you know, TED Talks are 18 minutes. That's it. You go 18 minutes and 1 second. Chris Anderson comes out with a hook and you're out of there, folks. Game's over. Haidt did a talk that was stunningly wonderful for about 15 minutes. And then he stopped. He says, well, that's about what I wanted to say. And if you're watching that recording, you go, wait a minute. You get 18 minutes. That is your only 18 minutes to be a TED speaker, unless you're extraordinary and you're going to stop at 15 minutes. And what he did in the next breath was say, well, anyway, that's how TED wants me to do a presentation. But if I were doing my own presentation, here's how I would do it. And he goes back and does the same 15-minute talk in 3 minutes, but in an entirely different style. And in this case, instead of pretty much doing a lecture with some slides behind him, the slides were an integral part. He pulled out some of the most stunning images that he had used in the first 15 minutes, and he brought them up and was interacting with them in front of the audience in a way that made him and the slide deck inseparable. Now, he had the money to do that, and he had the resources to do that. The video that he used in the background was an extraordinary action, but I learned a lot from that. And you've seen me incorporate a little bit of that into what I do with you, where a lot of what we do is visual storytelling with our slides that augment and support and are integrated into the whole conversation, rather than being, okay, let's look at this slide and read those bullet points. No, we don't want to read to people what they can read for themselves. No, we don't want to take a visual medium like a PowerPoint slide and use it for nothing but a bunch of words. My feeling on that, and this is not my saying this is the only way to do it, you have to do it this way, but my feeling is those bullet points belong in this special little area called speaker notes. And in fact, what should be up on the slide is something that stimulates you and keeps the conversation going. Remember in session 1, I actually used Zoom's ability to have your slides as your background so that it felt, if the perception was right there, it felt like I was speaking to you with the slide deck behind me as if we were face to face. And it's all part of what I keep talking about in terms of face to face and online. We need to stop thinking that those are two different things, and we need to better understand what the differences are so that we can integrate what we know into that new setting and use them effectively. So if Zoom gives us the ability to have the slides feel like they're part of us rather than off to the side where my picture's on the left, my slide deck's on the right, and you're all little pinhole pictures or thumbnail sketches, demeaning you as learners, taking down the level of importance of you as learners. Think of that as opposed to what we're seeing today. If you're in gallery view, which I'm in right now, you're seeing all of us equally sized within the frame. And I don't know if it'll show up on the recording because I think the recording probably defaults whoever is the windiest at the moment and taking over the role of talking. But if we're in gallery view, we start to create the view that we really are equal partners in the learning process. Stopping for you to take that in. We are equal partners. And if you can do that in your own settings, you're well on the way to having a group of learners that will adore what you do, be influenced by what you do, feel comfortable enough to challenge you when you need to be challenged, ask the questions that most people are afraid to ask because they feel like that's a dumb question. We just keep reminding our learners, there are no dumb questions. Even if it strikes you as being the most inane question in the world, the learner respected you enough and trusted you enough to be able to ask that question. So we need to take that into account and answer it at that level. I see a couple more comments coming in. Like from Mahasan, that's what my kindergartner and her classmates do in Zoom class. Are we talking now about having everybody?
That was I was just affirming your comment about changing names.
Well, you nailed me. Yes, you all thought you had an adult in the room leading the session. No, this is the kindergartner who's pretending that he's an adult so that he can try to lead a session that's fun and transformative for you. Yeah, there's something nice about finding the kindergartner in all of us and building off that and walking out with the feeling that it was good. So what we've obviously been doing in the first part of this was trying to set the framework for what are we bringing to the room? What are the things we're happiest with? What are the things that are most challenging for us? And what are some of the ways around that? And again, if we look at something without a PowerPoint deck, assuming that even if you're not showing it, you have it. And the obvious question is, well, why make a deck if you're not going to use it? The answer is I look for big bang on everything I do. I don't want to do one thing that has one impact. If I use a PowerPoint deck, it's going to be part of the presentation. It's going to be a learning resource for learners who may not have been there and don't have the time to watch a 2-hour presentation like this or a 2-hour discussion like this, but they want to be able to go back and get the basic points. So visually they have that on the printout or whatever they use of PowerPoint. But most importantly, I've incorporated the basic script hitting the main points in a narrative form in the speaker notes. So it gives us something for those people who couldn't be there. And for those of you that are here and don't necessarily want to go back and watch all 2 hours of this, but want to say, well, what were some of the basic things he covered today? You can go back to those slides and see the same points being made through our discussion in that deck. And one final thing, total disclosure here, I think this came up in the first session where I'm not one of those people that thinks if I have 45 slides on a deck for 2-hour session, that I have to go through all 45 of those slides. And a question justifiably came up in session 1. So why make a deck? It's what Allison was talking about and others are acknowledging here. The deck is my security blanket. It helps me get where I need to get. But especially in a 6-part series, if I don't cover everything I wanted to cover in those slides that I think you need to know, I just pull those out of the existing sessions deck and pop them into the next session's deck. That explains to you why sometimes it takes you a little bit to get the final deck after the sessions. I try to go back immediately afterwards. Whatever was not used gets pumped into the deck for the next session, and I'll go back and fine tune anything that came up in the existing deck. So what is my PowerPoint deck? My deck is a presentation tool. It augments the presentation. It's a learner tool, both as a review tool for those of you that have been there, and it's an introductory level tool for those that may not have wanted to watch the live session in all 2 hours of its wonderful glory, where not a word was wasted. Let's stop there and debrief that. Anybody have any questions about that process?
I do. From my experience, there can be participants who feel frustration when they see that there was a deck that created content, that included content that is not being covered. I have a weekly wellness class I go to, and it's clear to me that the facilitator is letting our content and conversation lead. But I think some of the folks feel like, oh, we didn't get to everything. We spent all this time talking. I'm just here to, get the information given. So I'm just wondering, it seems to me that the remedy for that is just to be intentional and to state the trainer's intention with the deck and the process of what they plan to use. But I was just wondering if you had a different suggestion, or if my co-conspirators here have a different perspective on what might be effective.
Before I comment, that is the perfect way to have done that. What do other people say in reaction to what you just heard from Mahasan? Anybody, let's get somebody to unmute and give a reaction. As simple as I agree, I disagree, or I'm not sure. But let's get some interaction going here.
You mean about content? Can you hear me now?
Yes, that's wonderful. That's magic. Look at
it turns out that I still have the plug connected of it. So
Tech support 101, you've done well.
yeah,
And look, the name changed. Don't think I didn't notice that. Victor, I got you nailed. I've already got the name sheet in front of me and I remember. I love that you are now Jedi Knight. Look at how playful this is. This is fabulous. Go ahead.
well, yeah, I've actually come up. It has come up on times where you don't address all the slides in your presentation. So that's also one of the reasons why I don't like to put a lot of stuff on my presentations. Like you said, just ideas of what I'm about to talk, the things I like to talk about, just in case I don't happen to cover them with the same extent that the rest of the presentations. Because sometimes people start asking you questions and you start spending more time on that particular slide that we originally thought you will. And at the end, you're just rushing through them all. So that's what I don't like doing. So yeah, but it has come up the time where we said, well, we didn't address that as much. Can we go back and let's talk about a little bit about that one? Yeah, I agree with her.
Great. At least one other person in the group. What's your reaction to that question of what about those people who worry that they missed something because they didn't get to see the whole deck? Okay, just keep this moving a little bit. We are going to start pretending we're in a classroom. I'm going to call names. So change your name fast before I know who you are. Angie, can you unmute? Any reaction you have to what Mahasan said?
I think in that situation, if it's obvious that there's like people feeling like anxiety about not getting through the deck or whatever, like the trainer offering reassurance that the like subtopic or being off topic or having dialogue is actually part of the process and it's valuable, and then reassuring everyone that the slide deck will be sent in an email, or just kind of like offering the reassurance that like whatever is happening is like part of it and important. And if it's not, then the trainer should kind of like curtail it or end it or say, okay, this is great, but we got to move on. We got to keep going. Like just kind of reading the room. So like if more people in the room feel or appear to be anxious, then you got to move on. But if it's like a lot of people are engaged and it's like a positive experience, then kind of just like making sure like everyone's kind of like in the same, like feeling positive, I guess. I don't know if that makes sense.
That makes perfect sense.
I agree with that completely, Angie. And I really liked how Cheryl would handle that in our discussions. Like she would have built-in Q&A slides and like pause in our instruction and ask, have those built-in discussion times. But then she did at certain instances say like, this is a really great discussion, but like, we do have more that we need to cover. So like, let's, continue this conversation either offline or, continue with the rest of the content and see if more ideas bubble up from this. So I think that's another way that instructors can kind of address that, spirited discussion, but also like make sure that they're keeping on task with everything that they need to cover.
Key phrase there. Let's continue that offline. Think about how you work with a library patron that needs more time than you have to give them. At some level, you're going to say, here's some other stuff you can try. I need to move on. And you can always come back to me, or here's some other resources, but you give them the next step. And that's what Cheryl is doing there, is what we do in these sessions, where if we get too far into something and we know that there are things that we want to cover before the end of a session, we leave that door open. Again, we don't think about this often enough, I think, in virtual settings. If you're in a physical setting, face-to-face, you're there ahead of time. If you do what I do, you're there a good half hour ahead of time to make sure all the technology is in place before the earliest of the early learners will arrive. So at the minute the first person arrives, you're not messing around with your technology. You're not reviewing your slide deck. You're not sitting there with your back to the learners as they enter the room. You're greeting them, chatting with them, asking something as simple as, how are you doing? How are things going for you? Identifying up front if there's anything that's going to be a difficulty for them in that session that day, because maybe they've had an emotional evening or an emotional morning that they want to deal with before they get their minds into what you're working with them on. And we do that here. You know that if if you want to show up early, that Christine and I are here and we'll chat with you. And if you have the time after the session formally ends, you can stay for a post-session discussion. That is a simple act of creating the lounge virtually, creating the informal classroom virtually, so that your learners don't feel rushed and they don't leave with the anxiety that comes from thinking, oh, we only saw 10 of the 50 slides that we're going to show. I know an absolutely brilliant presenter who I adore, and I will go out of my way to see this person speak whenever I get a chance to see them speak. But everybody that knows the person has two things that they kind of joke about behind the person's back, and I think he's aware of it and laughs with them. But the first question is, how many slides is he going to have for his 45-minute presentation today? It'll range from 100 to 200 slides for a brief presentation. It's a quick deck and it's really lively, but the joke is nobody does 100 to 200 slides for a 45-minute presentation. So joke one is, how many slides will he have? And the second joke is, or question is, how long after he walks up on the stage in front of all of us will he take off his suit jacket and just get down to shirt and tie instead of having the suit jacket on? I mean, it's funny and it's kind of a collegial thing, but I think when we start focusing on that rather than on the impact of what that brilliant mind shares with us, that we're learning, we're avoiding something that's important. And we've just talked about in here about the importance of not making the deck the important thing, using it as a backup tool, as an assistant for us, but focusing on the learners keeps us where we need to go as we think about what we want to do as trainers and learning facilitators. Any other comments on this before we move on? My question to you is, was that helpful? Quick yes or no. You can put it in chat or just unmute yourself. Okay, I'm seeing a thumbs up. I'm seeing some heads nod. Even our Jedi Knight said it was helpful. Yes, yes, and yes. All right, in the last part of the first session here, again, I normally don't call attention to the passage of time, but I'm really trying to make a strong point here today that without a deck, we haven't really lost anything. It's moving along. We're learning. We're discussing the basic points we have to do. We're getting the wisdom of the crowd going here. We're stressing that idea of us all being co-conspirators. So as we move into some more meat of this and then some more discussions in the second half about the actual hands-on stuff that we do, let's reset the context here. You remember we've talked about the ADDIE model, the instructional design model that starts off with assessing the need that you're going to meet. And then it moves into the design and development phases where you're preparing your materials, scripting out things, thinking about what kind of presentation you're going to do in terms of, are you going to lecture? Are you going to do something experiential? Are you going to use a flipped classroom model? Are you going to involve some gaming in the whole thing? You work through all that stuff. And then you get to the day of implementation. So today, the heart of what we're doing and will continue to do focuses on the letter I in ADDIE, the implementation step. And that includes those moments of preparing so that if your technology goes out on you or if there are any other problems, you know how to deal with that. What I'd love to do for the next few minutes before we take our first break is talk about some different methods of how we present. Nothing here is revolutionary or new to you, but what I want to do is instill in you a real strong awareness of some of the different components that you can play with as you're designing your session and delivering it. Big spoiler alert, you don't have to commit to only using one of these. In fact, as you know from what we've talked about earlier in terms of chunking material so that learners get it in bite-sized chunks and they get a chance to play with it and absorb it and then build upon it. If you use a couple of different methods rather than one method all the way through, you're going to find that your learners appreciate it, their eyes stay open longer, and their attention spans don't have a chance to reach the breaking point where, like a rubber band, you pulled so far apart that it snaps, and then all of a sudden you've lost them. The one thing I would ask for you to do at this point, if it's easy for you, if you've got a pen or pencil and a piece of paper, is as I go through these different methods, just jot down the method that I will explicitly identify for you, so that at the end of this, we can have a quick discussion about what method you want to use in your presentation and what you're most comfortable with. Again, full disclosure, if we were doing a slide deck and using the slide deck, when we got to the discussion, all these things would be up there in summary form, so you wouldn't have to remember them. But again, we have technology that we can use, which is paper, pen, or pencil, to take those notes and prepare that without a slide. And one more story I want to tell you before we move into this is when we talk about the use of PowerPoint decks, and it depends on the size of the audience, I've seen two people that I think are absolute presentation masters among many, many people I've seen, especially through the American Library Association. One is a great colleague, Pat Wagner out of Denver. Pat used to do a lot with info people. I don't know if she still does, but Pat does the most wonderful, inclusive and engaging conflict resolution classes, difficult patron classes, difficult colleague classes. And I don't think Pat has ever in her lifetime ever used a slide deck. And that's wonderful because Pat has the personality and the comfort level to go in a room, do more or less what we're doing today here, where we don't need the deck. It's the interaction with the participants, with the co-conspirators that makes it fly. Another great presenter who, if you don't know her, you want to look her up, is Maureen Sullivan, a former president of the American Library Association. I've known Maureen for years. She actually did some leadership work with another great colleague, Pete Bromberg, leadership trainings through the American Library Association. And again, Maureen, I've never seen her use a slide deck. And I've never heard anybody walk out of a session and say, oh, that was so lousy. God, I didn't learn a thing from Maureen. If she'd only had slides, I would have gotten there. And what Maureen and Pat and so many of us try to bring into the room, and I would encourage you to bring that same thing, is what's in here, the experiences we have that are useful to the learners, the evidence-based research we can bring to our learners, the playfulness that engages the learners, the assurance that the learner is important, that we are part of the gang, we are not the front of the room, center stage all the time. That's important stuff to know. And now let's talk about how we might use that. Obviously, the first one you want to write down so that you've got this later is the first style is lecture. So let's talk about lecture. I'm not going to give a lecture on lectures, by the way, that would just be too uncool. But I've heard over years and years and years that the lecture is dead and nobody's using it anymore, and lectures bore people because it's not experiential enough. Well, frankly, you know me enough to know I'm going to disagree with that at a certain level. A great lecture can be engaging. A great lecturer can get you engaged simply by stimulating thought and encouraging you after the session to take that out and enjoy it and employ it. A great lecturer inspires you to absorb that information in a way that makes sense to you. And a great lecturer understands that if they talk to you for 30, 60, or 90 minutes, you're not going to remember every word. Probably going to remember one of the first things said up front. This is why I always start off with these stories. If you remember nothing else from today, you'll probably remember that story of Fernando, who was a great instructor and only at the end had that moment of reveal that told the audience why that was such an important topic and so meaningful to Fernando to address with other learners. We want to give people those kind of anchors up front, and a great lecture does that. Great lecture has thematic flow to it that keeps bringing you back. It'll build on something, but it returns you to the earlier examples, so that it's the difference between a lecture with about 10 bullet points, not necessarily all interconnected, but thematically connected, as opposed to a smooth flowing, almost work of art that inspires you and makes you want to be that person or be able to do what that person did in terms of lecture. Now, again, I'm not a big fan of lecture, especially in a virtual environment, because it's too easy for people to start kind of looking off and nodding off. And if you do this too long, you deserve to lose your audience. And you probably ought to ask yourself why you thought that was a great idea. But when used effectively, especially if you're lecturing in small chunks, as I tend to try to do at least, it can be effective and make points as long as you draw people back in. So that's a brief introduction to lecture. Next obvious one, demonstration. So if you're writing these things down, method 2 is the demonstration. You do something, you show how to do it, you have other people do it, and that takes us kind of into experiential, which is the fourth of the ones I want to do. But let's stay on demonstration by itself. If you're doing something complex and people are confused by it, your goal is to make it as easy for them to get those steps down. So again, you may do that in screenshots in a slide deck. You may do it with handing out a cheat sheet. Guidance to you there. Let's get away from those cheat sheets that are nothing but text and bullet points, where the keystroke command on a computer is in bold type and all the other type is in basic type to differentiate the two. But it says steps 1 through 10, here's what you do. Let us meet our learners where so many of them are today. That cheat sheets can be visual also. They can be something as simple as a photograph or an image that conjures up the whole process for people. They can be the screenshots that are there side by side with the instructions. They can be, as some people are doing in a course I'm doing right now through the American Library Association on online tutorials. I've got some people that are experimenting with infographics as online tutorials. And I think it's a wonderful one. I've never actually gone that route myself, but it's something I've been aware of for a long time. I'm fascinated by it. This is the week when I'm going to see the learners online tutorials in their draft form, and I'm looking so forward to seeing how somebody takes their infographic in a library setting and does a very specific thing for their learners so that it's playful, it's visual, it's easy to absorb, and it's usable at the learner's pace, where if they get stuck on step 3, they can just look back at steps 1 and 2 and see the graphic things that make that sheet so much fun to use. So that's demonstration in a variety of ways. A third method, of course, is discussion. I don't think I have to say much about it. Today's whole session is an example of discussion and its benefits. If this works for you, you'll have walked away thinking, I can incorporate that more fully into my work. If I didn't do this effectively, you're going to say, I think I can do that better. I would challenge you to come back and do a presentation toward the end of this, our 6 sessions, that uses discussion as its primary method, so you can show the rest of us what it could be even better than what we've been doing today. I alluded a minute ago to step 4, or the method 4 that I want to talk about a little bit, experiential. It's just jargon, fancy talk for have them experience what you want them to learn. If you want them to be able to look up a book on a computer, demonstrate it, and then have them look up a book on a computer or a CD or a DVD or whatever it is that you want them to do. If you want somebody to be able to use a self-checkout machine, make sure that they have a chance to actually use it themselves and discover what the problems are in that whole system. So I think experiential is something that really is important. I think it's an effective way. Every bit of research I've seen suggests that people learn by doing. So an experiential approach to this is a really positive one. Gaming is something we've been hearing about for 10 or 20 years, and I'm almost getting tired of reading articles in my trade journals saying, oh yes, gaming is taking over the world and we have to do more gaming and learn. It's like, folks, you've been saying that for 20 years. If we're going to do it, let's do it. Let's stop talking about it. But I think there's a real fun place for games and gaming. Certainly, you've gotten that sense from Cheryl from the session she's done. I know Cheryl well enough to know she's always doing playful things, icebreakers at the beginning of a session, or having to do stuff where it's mildly fun, competitive, but it all focuses back on you gaining something from the session that you can use yourself in training other trainers. So it's not something to overlook. And if you can find a game that is integral to the kind of thing you're doing, or you can create a game or some kind of an activity that is integral to what you're doing, you're on the right track to having a successful session, because nothing stands out as being sort of an unusual add-on. It's all part of the process in a way that makes people understand, I wanted to do that. Case studies, lovely, lovely thing. I may have told you a little bit in session 1 about going through a 4-day train the trainer that Cheryl Gould and others did back in 2001 under the auspices of Info People. That is a magnificent example of what we're talking about. What we experienced, it's been so long, I don't remember the day-to-day breakdown, but I'm sure on day 1, we did a lot about learning theory, and we interacted with each other, we got to know each other, and we started setting ourselves up as a community of learning along the lines of what Peter Senge wrote about in his book that was done in the 1990s about organizations and how they create communities of learning. Cheryl turned me on to that book. It's one I've read, and I'm forgetting the title off the top of my head, but if you look up Peter Senge, you'll see that he's done some writing about community of learning. And that's what our Train the Trainer session gave us at the beginning. You know, I have overtly encouraged you to have that here through the discussions we have, encouraging you to be in touch with each other, encouraging you to see this not as standalone sessions, but part of the overall process that you've had through the CLA leadership program. Integrate it with what you've had before, integrate it with what comes later, and stay in touch with each other so that community of learning becomes a tool to you. So case studies that we're talking about what I got out of that Train the Trainers, it all led to the final day when we each did a sample presentation, and Cheryl critiqued it, if I remember correctly, and we all critiqued each other in the most positive ways. We had videos made of that so we could go back and review that later to see how we looked. That's a frightening thing to people who have never seen themselves on video, but it's really a nice thing to be able to go back afterwards. I would suggest to you that if everybody does participate in sessions 5 and 6 doing presentations, knowing that Christine is making these available to us, the recordings of these afterwards, go back, and as scary as it sounds, watch yourself, but don't be overly critical. Watch yourself and first celebrate what you did right, and then rewatch it and ask yourself, what could I have done better? So that instead of shaming yourself over the things that didn't go right, you're using it as a learning opportunity. This may surprise you, because I think it surprises some of my great colleagues who I've known for years. When I'm on some kind of a recorded presentation, whether it's a video or it's only audio, if I have the time, as soon as the recording is available, I will go back and listen to it or watch it to see how it went. it's always instructive to me. And I've gotten over that thing of going, oh, you didn't comb your hair right. Okay, I don't have to comb my hair right anymore. That's not an issue. What I really look for is the interactions that I had with people, the moments when I may have paused too long, or the moments when I may have inadvertently stepped on somebody else who was trying to talk and had to back off, so that I learned how to deal with that better. I don't think we ever get past the point where we don't need to be reviewing our work. If I'd had more time in this session, which the series of sessions, which are very tightly timed, as you well know, I would be taking the 2 hours afterwards to go back and watch at least parts of it to see how our interactions worked, see if there were any tech difficulties. Fortunately, some of you like Christine and others have been nice enough to say, oh, we're hearing the paper rattle in the background. See, if she hadn't said that, I wouldn't know that until afterwards. And I'd be listening to it going, what's that sound? Was I eating popcorn? Oh no, that was the papers. I would learn to deal with that in this particular setting. But we all learn from that. We never move past the stage where reviewing our work helps us. So Train the Trainers is a case study from info people. I learned a lot. You're getting some of that from me. You're getting some of it from each other. And with any luck, you will sooner than later be in the position that I'm in, helping others and teaching them how to be better trainers and teaching them the skills that they need. And finally, reflection. There is never enough time for us to look back and think about what we experienced, reflect on what we really want to take out of that experience, reflect on how we can use that, apply it within our own work site to the benefit of ourselves, our organization, and our learners. The reflection is built into that, and that implies what happens in the ADDIE model. At the end of it, after you've evaluated the successes and acknowledged the things that were not so successful, you just circle back and you start it over. So it's reflect and revise. Again, giving you the topics that we've got here: lecture, demonstration, discussion, experiential, gaming, case studies, and reflection. When we come back after about a 5-minute break here, we'll work into a little discussion of what works for you, what is most daunting to you, and how we can work around that. And we'll get into a few other things before the end of the day today, but we'll do what we always do now. I'm going to pause the recording so that anybody that wants to have some private conversation here can do that. If you just want to disappear for 5 minutes, mute yourself, take the camera off, take that phenomenal walk up Alvarado Street in Monterey that we so often joke about. Take that walk and come back in about 5 minutes. But as soon as I pause the recording, I'll stay here to answer any questions you have. Let's see if I can do this right now. That's stop, that's pause. Okay, here we go. Welcome back to the second half of session 3 here. We're going to change things out a little bit before we go back to what we were talking about before the break. You've heard me speak of Sardik. Again, I'm going to mention him as somebody whose techniques I absolutely adore: playful, energetic, engaging. And one of the things he has done in some of the sessions I've seen is remind us of the importance of being observant in the settings in which we work. We've talked about that a little bit in the early part of today's session, of watching for the body language of what's going on there, watching for those moments when maybe the learners are confused a bit, and we need to acknowledge that. So what I've done is I've replicated in my own inimitable way an exercise that Sardik did in one of his sessions, and it's a whole thing about being observant. So you may notice something a little bit different. There are 3 things different right now in what you're seeing from my side than what you saw in the first hour. Without having prepped you and say, I want you to pay attention to what everything looked like, see if you can identify the 3 things that are different right now from what you saw in my feed earlier. Anything obvious? Okay.
You took off your glasses?
Yes, thank you. That was the hardest one. I'm having trouble seeing, so now I can put it back on. All right, the glasses disappeared. Good, thank you. Next one. What's the second of the 3 things? The placement of the photo and title, but there's even something more subtle in there. Do you notice anything else about what's behind me? I made this difficult. I didn't want this to be such an easy thing that we were done with it in 5 seconds.
Did you change the, well, before I could see the trainer at the top, now I just see a row.
Okay, it's all tied into that. Yes, because I was changing that background, it didn't totally match up, but there's an element of that also. I didn't even notice that the trainer was missing. So there's 4 or 5 differences. Look at that. I didn't even observe it enough. There's one other element of that that's really subtle, but it's different. play Jeopardy here. Give it about another 5 seconds. The subtle difference there is the CLA logo has replaced the CLA Learning Leadership Series logo that has been up there for the first hour. They look almost identical. The big difference is that you don't have the reference to the leadership thing. Third thing, something about the clothing. Is there anything different there that you notice? Yeah, somewhat subtle, but maybe you need to change the view on your screen so that it's speaker view and you can see me a little bit larger than if it's all thumbnails. Can I try to be as subtle about this as possible, but I'm assuming somebody that pays attention to clothing may have noticed a slight difference there. That almost gives it away because there's not that much in terms of clothing up there. Okay, do you remember what good, Christine got its tie. Anybody see the difference in the ties? The one I was wearing before had little red diamonds on it. Ooh. I was looking for ties this morning. I'm thinking, your ties are way too similar to each other. You need to branch out a little bit. So what is that doing for us? It's a playful way to reintroduce the session, just in case you were getting tired. And right now, please go back to gallery view so that you can see each other all at the same size there. We were getting used to kind of falling into a pattern in the first part where I would put a challenge to you, we would discuss it, we would debrief it, and then move on to something. We would discuss it, debrief it, and move on. And what we've done at the beginning of the second half of today's session is played with something that was totally unexpected, came out of left field. There was no prep of, all right, pay attention to this, now spot the differences. It was just, this is something that some people might notice, but it's not something we pay attention to. And the point of this, of course, is when we're in our learning environments, it's natural for most of us to filter out anything that isn't essential. And that's good. We want our learners focusing on the essentials. But for us, we have to expand our vision just a little bit and say, beyond the essentials of what we want to pay attention to, like, why is that person in the back row falling asleep right now? Or why is that person looking at a movie and I can see that on their background of their screen when they should be engaging with others here? At the larger view, we want to take that slightly bigger thing to stay ahead of our learners and anticipate their needs, anticipate what's going on with them so that we can respond in an effective way. So I hate things where you do a little game like that and then it doesn't integrate back into things. We will keep coming back to this in the second session of paying attention, noticing the differences and getting ourselves comfortable with it. But to pick up where we left off, let's go back to the notes that you should have now about the different methods of presenting. I'll do one more read here to make sure that you've got it. I see some, oh, Mahasan is having trouble with audio. We're gonna wait just a second to make sure that she's back in. Welcome back.
Hi,
We
my
did
internet stopped right as I answered.
not a thing to apologize for. What we actually did, and something that I want you to be aware of, as soon as we saw that you were having trouble with the audio, we just paused and said, let's wait for her to come back in and it will pick up. Easy thing to do. And it's great for your learners too, because if you point out that they didn't miss anything, it immediately takes down any anxiety they may have been feeling. So what I was about to jump into is the idea of, let's review and make sure you have those methods in front of you. And then I'm going to ask you a couple questions about methods of delivery. So your notes should be lecture, demonstration, discussion, experiential, gaming, case studies, reflection. Anybody need anything repeated? Anybody need a new necktie? No, just kidding. All right, so which of those forms are you most comfortable with as a learning facilitator and why?
Are we allowed to have a mix?
Absolutely, bingo, that's what I'm looking for.
So the
If I
three
were
that
giving out
I
gold stars, Allison just got the first one of the day. Ding, 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 ding.
the three that I would mix are lecture, experiential, and discussion. And those are the three that I've used most often in presenting to staff at my system. And it's usually like I do a little presentation. So the one that comes to mind is I did a big story time training for our system where I was like basically trying to train a bunch of library assistants on how to do story times. So I did like a presentation on different types of story times and the materials we had available. And then I provided time for everybody to like look through all the materials that we have in our admin offices that are available for loan. And then we had asked everybody to come prepared to share their favorite book and song. So then they got to practice on the audience, like of everybody who was participating. And then we had a discussion about what worked and what didn't work on different people's presentations. So it was kind of a combination of all three over the course of like a 2.5-hour training.
Wonderful. Now, that just raised a question for me, and it ties back into the ADDIE model. Did you do any sort of evaluation afterwards to see if that transformed people's ability to do story times in a better way?
I think that we had like some paper survey, but I did this like maybe like 2 months before COVID. And so it kind of was like everything that I probably need to like redo the training, because everything that everybody learned probably just flew out the window pretty quick, because it was kind of disaster zone very quickly. But I think we had some sort of survey about like, you know, very basic questions. But the whole point was that they could go back to their branches and do story time, and we'd be able to evaluate based on that, like, and do follow up in a month or so. And then COVID happened. So
Got it. Remember, it's something that we've talked about a little bit in terms of what that 6 disciplines taught us and what ADDIE teaches us. When we evaluate, there's a bunch of different levels we can evaluate at. Did you like it? Was it okay? Are you going to use it? But when you get down to the real impact at a level 4 evaluation, in terms of what Kirkpatrick writes about in his 4 levels of evaluation, you want to see what the real impact is in terms of how people told their stories and how that affected the audience, those hearing the stories, to see what the play out was. So if you get back into that situation, that's not an easy thing to do, but it's also not extremely difficult. You can sort of set up some measurements of what you wanted in your goals and objectives in terms of what the difference was in the storytelling and the impact it had on the audience. And then you can say to people, look at how phenomenally powerful that was. Anybody else want to tackle the same question about which style or which method or which group of methods are you most comfortable with and why? Not totally confused. I was just looking at names and going, oh, we lost Jedi Knight. Now I have to relearn Victor. Good job, Victor. See, this is something you want to keep your learners on their toes a little bit. And you also want to keep your learning facilitator on his or her toes a little bit. And what Victor's doing is a wonderfully playful and appropriate thing, given the context that we've set up here. Kudos. Second gold star. I wish I had gold stars where I could actually just put them on my screen, but then I wouldn't be able to see you. Anybody else want to jump in with that idea of what works for you and what do you like and why?
I like discussion because maybe because I like to talk, but I also like to learn from others and I like to keep people engaged. I struggle with that a little bit, or I know that some people struggle with that. I've heard from more introverted colleagues that they don't want to talk to people. They don't want to have conversations. So I don't really know. I mean, I think the answer to that is just that to have a mix of things. You know, some things some people might like, some they might not like as much. But I enjoy discussion.
You've raised inadvertently a great point to be made here. I didn't even build this into it, but you were talking about some people don't like to talk. Let's ask ourselves something. And again, thumbs up, thumbs down. Do you think there are people that don't like to talk? Okay, I'm seeing some head nods. Do you think there are some people that, given a chance to talk about something that's important to them, that they will not talk about it? Okay, there I'm only seeing 2 heads here. So Allison's putting in something that I think I very much agree with, people who don't like to talk in particular situations. But I think given a chance, most people, if you engage them at a level that's important to them, they will have something to say. So our challenge as learning facilitators is to find what's important in that learning situation, what we're trying to address, again, focusing on their needs and the needs of what they're going to do when they go back to apply that learning in their library situation or any other situation. Make sure we nail what's important to them and we determine that. And that takes us back to the assessment phase of ADDIE. If you're going to do a course, first of all, figure out what the real need is. Figure out that pain point. Once you know that, then you're on your way to having something that will make people want to talk. Granted, if you're on video on Zoom and you know it's being recorded, there will be some people who say, that's not going to be me. I'm not going to be talking. I'm not going to be recorded. I don't want that out there. But if you can find ways like you stop the recording, or you offer them a chance to do some kind of a virtual drop-in office hour so that they can have those kind of intimate discussions outside of the formal course, I believe you can get just about anybody talking as long as the reason for talking is that it helps them to get what they need to get to. Allison has a comment in here. I had a recent experience with that, where my friend's mom really opened up to me about her husband's death when she hadn't opened up to him about it. It depends on who you're talking to. Absolutely. And again, that's our challenge. We have to be that person that people are comfortable talking to. That's something to consider. That doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't necessarily happen in a 2 or 3 hour workshop. It doesn't necessarily happen in a 1 hour webinar. But the other side of it is, I have seen that happen in 1 hour webinars. I have seen that happen in sessions like this, where people will come in and at first think, I'm just going to go there and listen. That's all I need to do. But something touches them during the session, some moment of revelation, as obvious and personal as what Allison talked about. Friend's mom talking about her husband's death. I have relatives who in their 80s and 90s had not talked about things that happened to them early in their lives. And as they were reaching the end of their lives and their attitudes towards life changed, they started to open up in the most incredible ways. And I'll be totally honest here. My father's at that stage in his life. He's telling me stories over the last few years that I'd never heard from him. This is somebody I've known literally all my life. And I'm still learning fabulous things. Why? Because it's important to him. Why else? Because I'm willing to listen. I will just sit with him, hold his hand and say, tell me that story. Tell me something I haven't heard. Now, we're not going to be in a classroom holding our learners' hands, but there are emotional, I love to laugh at that. Yeah, I'm going to go out there and just grab everybody's hand and we're going to sing Kumbaya. I mean, we're not going to physically do that. And yet there are teaching training techniques that are the equivalent of it. And Mahasan said, I find out my 14-year-old talks about his fears about going to high school with our neighbors, but not much with us. Not sure why, maybe because they ask direct questions that I don't. That may be unanswerable. But if it is answerable, that is something that will come as a result of you building up trust with that 14-year-old in a way that was different than the trust you had with the 8-year-old version of that person, and the difference that you'll have with that person at age 30. We know that from our own lives. There are points where there are people we will not talk to, and there are different points in our life, given the passage of time and the change of circumstances, that suddenly we'll talk about them. The example of my own father having held back some stories, nothing shameful about these, mind you. They're actually quite funny stories, but I don't think he saw them as the kind of stories that he wanted to tell his teenage son or his toddler son, who would say, you really did that? I mean, at this age, I think it's funny. I wish I had done some of the stuff he didn't tell me about before. So raising this is not an intentional thing to make you feel guilty or bad about the fact that maybe people don't talk to you as much or you can't get people to talk. It's an awareness. It's that whole thing of just noticing what's going on around, the difference between the tie I'm wearing now and the one I did earlier, the logo behind me and the logo that was up there earlier. We notice the little things and we react to those. And then we go for the bigger issues at a substantial level. But it does depend a lot on how we present ourselves, the trust that we engender among the people that we're with, and our willingness to even shift our own assumptions at some point to make sure that we're meeting other people's assumptions. And the honesty, the willingness to listen to a criticism that comes, knowing that it was made from the best of intentions or with the best of intentions, so that we become better trainers. And then the other side of that, of course, is filter out the trash. If people are going to troll you and they're just going to be argumentative with you, that doesn't require that we try to understand why they got that way or what their infancy included that led them to be that kind of person. We just don't have that kind of time. I tell people in a classroom setting, I'm really not a social worker and I'm not here to try to figure out why you have the problems you had. I'm here to help you address them. A lesson I learned from Pat Wagner, who I mentioned earlier, don't necessarily have to deal with people's past, their whole past, to get them where they are in a specific learning situation. But the more we know, the more empathetic we can be, the more understanding and supportive we can be, the better the world is for a result of us having trained together. One more person, anything about those different methods we saw and what you're comfortable with and why you're comfortable with them? I'd love to get a third perspective here. Again, I'm going to mix it up a little bit. I think it's been a while, Inga, since I've heard anything from you. Anything you want to add?
Not right now. Sorry.
Okay, fair enough. Angie, anything you want to add?
No, thanks though.
Okay, fine. So moving on now. my own notes here. We have talked in our first part about the things that are most fearful to us, the things that we actually like. We've taken that down to methods of delivery and what's going to be useful to us as we think about the presentations. And I'm hoping you're all spending more time thinking about now. So that in sessions 5 and 6, you have a chance to practice what we've been talking about. In terms of preparing, let's do a couple of simple things and then look at a couple of examples that will help us. This section, if we were looking at slides, would be a slide that tells you basic tips and reminders. The 3 elements here are to practice, to experiment, and as we've talked about in earlier sessions, to embrace failure, not fear it, but embrace it and build upon it. Practice is such an essential part of what we do. It's why I've encouraged us, especially today, to spend so much time interacting with each other via Zoom. Because obviously sessions 5 and 6 are going to involve you being comfortable enough on Zoom to try to train people to do something that you think they're interested in. Now, what you're doing is really preparing a training to use in your own library. So you don't necessarily have to think of, if you decide you're going to train people on how to use a self-check machine, that you're going to teach all of us that, knowing we're going to go use your self-check machine. We're going to be your test audience. And it's really a chance for you to practice your presentation chops, see what worked, what didn't work, and refine that thing before you take it into your own workplace. But practice is essential. I've said this before to you. There's not a one of us that doesn't benefit from practicing, from some level of rehearsal. I know people that will spend hours in front of mirrors so they can watch themselves and see how that goes. That's not going to be me. My version of that is to look at the recordings afterwards, see what went well and what didn't go well. But you have to determine for yourself what's going to be there. Experimenting is a natural thing. Each time you're in front of an audience, and preferably, I want you to switch around those words and think of it a different way. Each time you're with your co-conspirators in learning, you want to make sure that you are reacting to what they need and what they're doing there, and experiment with stuff to see if it will work. Some of it will, some of it won't. But being transparent with people and saying, here's what I'm doing and here's why I'm doing it, helps them to understand and learn from it and apply it to their own work. And again, embracing failure. It's the old Groucho Marx thing of, in a movie, they actually scripted this in where he intentionally tells a joke that isn't funny. And then he looks straight at the camera and says, well, they can't all be funny, and goes right back into it. That unexpected moment of watching what you know is a film that was scripted and having somebody look at you straight and breaking that fourth wall of the theater and saying to you, they can't all be funny. It takes about 10 or 15 seconds. Thanks, Mahasan. It says you'll be right back. It takes you about 10 or 15 seconds to say, did he just tell a bad joke and then acknowledge it? And that was scripted, it's a movie. And then you laugh at the fact that he did it to you. And that's what we want to do. We want to be able to engage and entertain and inspire our learners at whatever level works. As we look at basic tips, I'm going to do something here that, again, is a little bit different than what we normally do in an environment like this, but I want to give you some, what I call 10 telepresence tips. Telepresence tips being that thing of you're on camera with other people and you want them to feel like you're in the same room that they are. These tips actually come from the book that I just put out earlier this year through Roman and Littlefield, Change the World Using Social Media. But they're based very much on the idea of, if we're going to have engagement with people and make them feel like they're part of us, that we have to be thinking about our background and how we approach that. So I'm going to say, just read them right out of the book and then we'll discuss them very, very quickly. The first of the 10 tips is do what I so often try to do, where you're looking directly into the camera rather than looking down at your notes. Notice as soon as I look down at the notes, there is at least a subliminal feeling on your part that I'm not engaging you. And so it's probably okay for you to turn away for a minute or to do something else. And you just keep wondering, when's he going to look back? Is he not paying attention to us? So a thing that if you haven't learned to do it, learn to look directly at the camera. Now let's look at the downside of that. I think I mentioned to you earlier, and if I hadn't, it's well worth repeating. We have to look at the camera with the understanding that that puts us at a bit of a disadvantage. Our field of vision is not what we think it is. It isn't 360 or even 180. When you are looking directly, and you can experiment with this right now by doing the same thing. Each of you look at your camera, do not look anywhere else, and ask yourself what the people in the Zoom thumbnails are doing. You don't know because you're looking at the camera and your field of vision is so limited that you can't see that, other than maybe to be aware of a little bit of motion that's there. So understand, it's good to look at the camera so you make eye contact, create that illusion. It's bad in the sense that then you're losing the eye contact that you have on the screen when you're seeing people do things, unless you sit back far enough that the distance between where your camera is and where the pictures are is so small that you can take in both things at the same time without breaking eye contact. There's ways around it, but it's a really good thing to be aware of, especially if you want to make sure that people feel engaged. The second thing is use a good headset or a microphone and speakers so you can see and be seen and heard clearly. It's adequate, I believe, to use a good laptop and to use the microphone within the laptop. You will notice the difference if you can make the one-time investment and buy a really good microphone. And you can get them for as cheap as $100 to $200. The one that Sardik had recommended to me and that I've been using for about 6 months now and really like is what's called a Yeti. It's a big, actually, I can't hold it up and show it to you because with the screen background here, it interferes with my ability to show you things. But it basically looks like a big alien creature that sits on a stand. You can imagine having arms and waving at you. But a Yeti mic picks up sound and gives you some control over how it picks up. The setting on the back side of this thing allows you to set it so that you're speaking directly into it. Or if you're having a two-way conversation, you change the setting and the microphone will pick up from both sides of the mic equally so both people can be heard. There's also a setting, especially for people that are musicians and want high quality. There's a setting on there that changes the quality of the sound on there. And there's something on there for what's called gain, which is the quality of the sound coming through, so you can even play with that. So a good microphone sets you up, and especially if you've got background noise, having a good headset to block that out is great. I actually don't anymore use the speakers on my laptop. I've got a slightly more expensive set, which again was probably only $30 or $40, but they plug in and it gives me stereo effect on either side of my speakers, so I can hear you, I can speak to you, and hopefully I'm coming across clearly enough that it creates the illusion that we're in the same space. Now, something that people don't think about in terms of visual presentation is if you're in a face-to-face setting and you also have some participants coming in from off-site and you're using Zoom to bring them into the room to interact with people there, this is possible and you can create that same telepresence, but it does require that you do a few things up front. Test the sound from different places of the room to make sure your microphone is picking up the sound of the voices of people in the audience. So that gets transferred through your laptop to people on the other end of that internet connection, and they're hearing and seeing each other, making sure the visuals are good so that somebody isn't in total dark silhouetted because the lighting on their faces wasn't right. If you're doing the kind of thing I'm describing now, when you're in a face-to-face setting with online participants also, thing you want to think about is where you're positioning your laptop and your microphone and how you're plugging into whatever speakers are in that room. If you do this right, and it's not hard to do this right if you have the right equipment, you can create the illusion that somebody from Chicago who's coming into your setting here in California and participating virtually, and you can see them up on the screen, you can create the illusion that they're in that room with you, and it does not take very long to do. I've done this often enough to know that it works. So think about those basic things of headset versus microphone versus speakers and the setting of your room, which then does take us to the issue of adjusting the lighting in your room. You know, I'm usually using backdrops that I produce through Zoom, and that I'm using a ring light behind my laptop that pretty much puts some even lighting on my face. I had to learn about not looking up too much because if I look up, it looks like I'm trying to hypnotize you because you see the ring in the ring light glasses. So there's that thing of understanding what the limitations are and using that. As I'm looking at the settings for those of you that are using a live feed, you can see Victor's lighting is fairly even, as is Mahassan's. Let me ask the two of you. Victor, first, unmute yourself. Tell me where your lights are and what kind of lighting you're using to create that effect.
It's coming from the window.
Okay, does that ever cause problems for you?
It does around noon. Wow.
Right. You will probably remember, because we would never do anything like this in a setting like this. You'll probably remember a session or two ago when some kind of a facilitator was leading the session, and about halfway through it, little rainbow prism images started coming on that person's face.
Yeah.
Because unfortunately I hadn't realized that there was a little crack in the drapes that I've got across the windows here, and the light was sneaking in through there as the sun moved. So what Victor pointed out is something I want you to think about when you're doing the lighting in your place. If you're using natural lighting, my guidance is don't, if you can avoid it, because as the sun shifts, it's going to change things. And what starts as a perfect image, and I think both Mahassan and Victor are getting that right now, where they're pretty nicely lit. If you were using a ring light, Victor, the front of your face would be a little bit more lit. You could control that, but it's not disturbing. It's not distracting. This seems to work well for you, and it's great. So think about that in terms of your lighting. Mahassan, same question to you. What's the source of lighting for you?
Well, I don't know how you all see it. To me, it feels like I'm glowing behind me, which I don't feel like is ideal, but I've got, this room's got windows all around. And then I did turn on the overhead light because I felt like there was some weird effect going on. The lighting in this room is weird, so I try not to actually use this room.
I'm wondering if it's the same question that we were just talking about in terms of the position of the sun. My memory of what you looked like at the beginning of this was I could see more of the background. And right now,
Oh,
you're right. I'm seeing more of a glow. Which direction are you facing? Which direction is the light coming into your room from?
All they're big windows on this side, and I guess when I moved, you could kind of see the window. Like there's a small window right here, and then there's another small window right there, and there are huge windows there. We just moved, so I got temporary blinds up. Don't judge me. But you see
Don't
when I
judge me, it's
shift
such a
my
great line.
when we shift my computer, you can see the light changes a little bit. So I think I was more here before, but just in that little shifting, I think it changed the lighting some. So.
Yeah. And there is a great tip for all of us to think about. If you know that the light's going to be streaming in from behind you, close those drapes ahead of time. Because that's the whole thing. What you were demonstrating a minute ago unintentionally is at some point your face almost blacked out completely because the light directly from behind you was affecting the camera to the extent where it was only reading the light.
Right.
So again, when I'm working in a room where I've got people coming in from a distance and I've got people in the same room, I'll generally lower all the drapes, which is sort of depressing because everybody wants the light from outside, but then I'll make sure that we pump up the light inside that it works well. Now, again, to be totally personal about it, Mahasan just talked about having the overhead light on. I stopped doing that. Let me demonstrate to you why I don't do that. Lovely glow off the top of my head really emphasizes the fact that I don't have hair. Also, it interferes with the ring light. You can probably see a little difference in the skin tone color as a result of just having turned on that one light. Turn it off and bingo, I'm back to looking like I'm a little bit less ghostly. The baldness is not an issue. One other thing I've noticed from using Zoom a lot, especially with backgrounds, look what happens if I lean too close to the screen. I get this little connector thing that makes it look like I'm beaming out of the room or that I'm hanging off the top of the slide. These are the things that you want to watch for when you're doing your rehearsals or even when you're in a live session, and then just adjust to them immediately. And clearly I've been doing this with these kind of backgrounds for a while now. So I've learned not to be positioned here to block out the logo that I so carefully wanted to put there. If I position myself midway, I'm blocking out a little of the picture, but nothing that's essential there. And again, it goes back to slide design. As you're thinking about what your background is going to be, make sure that the essential elements there are visible to you. So far as we're talking about preparing for a successful presentation, we've talked about looking directly into the camera, making sure that you've got a good headset and watching the lighting in your room to the extent that you can control it. And if you can't control it, see if you can find a different room or a different setting. A fourth tip here is be hypersensitive to the sounds around you. Case in point, the guy who in session 2 was trying to talk to you and all of a sudden the rustling of the papers was noticeable, not to him because I wasn't getting that feedback, but it was certainly noticeable to those of you that were listening and being distracted by it. Other sounds that could be a problem for you could include a heating system, a system where all of a sudden the air conditioner goes on and it sounds like you're in a windstorm because your microphone's too close to the heating or the air conditioning vent. These are things to think about. And you can test those by doing sample recordings, especially if you're working in Zoom. Just set yourself up for a session where you start recording yourself. Look at the camera, talk, move around a little bit, check or make sure that you're as close to your microphone as you need to be for your voice to carry out. Stop the recording, go back and listen for those things that you wouldn't have picked up, and listen very critically, very carefully for things that you normally would ignore. Because again, we tend to block out the details that are not important to us. We don't care what color tie the presenter or the facilitator is wearing, unless it's so god awful that it makes us look at the tie and not pay attention to what's going on there. We don't necessarily pay attention to what logo is behind, as long as it's an appropriate logo. We're not going to notice the difference between a CLA logo and a CLA leadership logo. But as a presenter, you want to be aware of those things and make sure they work for you. A fifth thing is use a simple background. Notice that I'm trying not to have too much clutter there. I've got an image that ties all 6 of these sessions together, that whole theme of we're collaborating, we're creating a community, we want to be as friendly as we can, almost like we're sitting around a campfire sharing stories. But when we walk out, those stories will have been transformative to us. And I always want to make sure that people are grounded and know what session they're in and what we're doing. So that's my simple background. I tend not to use big pictures when I'm doing formal training sessions, because if the picture competes with me and it doesn't totally tie into the whole session that we're doing, that's distracting to people too. But each person needs to approach that in their own way. So find a simple background, one that works for you. And if you're interested in really pursuing that, I think there's a site on Twitter called Room Rater. If I've got the name right, you can go to Room Rater and see hundreds, if not thousands, of backgrounds of people that have been doing Zoom sessions. And that's a real eye opener, because you see some absolutely stunningly beautiful things, and you see some embarrassing ones that you think, oh, I never want to do that. Please don't ever let me fall into that trap. And no, we won't be looking at some of those awful ones here, because they go beyond the pale, and I don't want to demonstrate that to you. But look at your background, both when you're doing your live sessions and when you can do recordings, go back and see how they work for you. Obvious, because we do so much of this together here, solicit comments from others, particularly if one person is dominating the conversation. You'll always have somebody that's real outgoing, and without thinking about it and without being aware of it, will have a tendency to take over a conversation. Fortunately, in this group, we don't have that. Everybody here seems to be a good enough trainer and a good enough leader to understand that there's a certain point to say things, a certain point when you need to breathe and let others speak. But asking questions, as Sardik has said so often, as I've been trying to point out to you and model for you, asking open-ended questions, not yes, no questions, but open-ended questions, and giving time for thoughtful responses, that is a way to engage people online as well as on site. If you're going to use social media and other tools in part of your presentation, the 7th tip would be use the tools and the equipment in conditions as close to the real live day of presentation when you do your test. If I'm going to do a session like this, I'm not going to test it on my tablet and then on the day of the event come in and do it on a laptop in an entirely different room with entirely different lighting and other background conditions than the day of the event. I believe I mentioned this, but again, it's a story well worth repeating. About a month or 2 ago, I was working with a wonderful producer for an online panel discussion where I believe there were 4 or 5 of us involved. And we did a fantastic rehearsal the day before. We've spotted a lot of problems that we fixed during the rehearsal. So on the day of the event, we showed up about a half hour early for the final pre-session check. And the first thing we noticed was when we were doing the pre-session check, my face was totally washed out where it hadn't been the day before. It had nothing to do with the lighting, same ring light, same closed drapes, no light was leaking through, and I couldn't figure it out. The producer was good enough to say, what shirt were you wearing yesterday during rehearsal? And I had to think back and I thought, oh, I was wearing a really bright blue shirt that complemented my skin color in a way that made it look good against the background we were using. And that day I was wearing a solid black shirt, and the change of tones in the shirt, the blackness there made my face wash out. Fortunately, we were doing this about 20 minutes before we went live, so I had time to turn off my camera, run into the other room, change back to the same shirt. This is something to think about. For all the time I've been doing this, I had never thought about making sure that even the clothing I was wearing was the same between the rehearsal and the actual day of delivery. So you never stop learning this stuff, and you always learn from the experience of having been there, but do rehearse as close to the real conditions as you can. An 8th point here is consider purchasing, if you're working from home and you're using Wi-Fi, think about purchasing a high quality gamer router to boost the strength and reliability of your video. For years, I was using a fairly good router downstairs. I'm in an upstairs office here in my home when I'm doing these things. And it was okay, but every once in a while, bandwidth would be a problem. And I'd get kicked out of sessions where I was leading them. You just know you can't do that. If you're leading a session, you have to have the best technology available. And if things go unexpectedly beyond your control, that's one thing. But if it's a routine problem that you're always facing, then you need to find something out. So I did what anybody would do. My tech guy was the guy down at Verizon who I would talk to every once in a while. And I described the problem. And that's when he mentioned those 2 words, gamer router. He says, that's the solution to your problem. So I believe it was about $150 to get the one I got, which is a Netgear gamer router. Plugged it in, and all of a sudden the whole online experience was entirely different. I had never experienced online video conferencing where I could see people and their mouths were moving at the same time the words were coming out of them. There'd always been a 2 or 3 second lag. The gamer router, well positioned in our house, which is another thing, make sure it's as close to where you're working as possible. If you're in a 2-story house and somebody's working downstairs, you're working upstairs, you want to be as close in the structure of that house to where that router is, so the signal can come through the walls and not have to travel up a stairway, through a hallway, through another hallway, through a closed door to get to you. So it's part positioning, but it's also having the right equipment. If you're having that problem, think about a gamer router as a solution to it. Having a backup plan, we've talked about a lot, having a second laptop, having a tablet, or having something else. And if all else fails, if you have to go audio when you were expecting to go audio and visual, go audio and just kind of understand you're not going to have your PowerPoint deck. People can see that later if they need to see that, but be ready to fly and operate with whatever situation you face. I think it was Mahasan earlier who said something that pretty much mirrors what I do. On a day of a presentation, I have the thing loaded onto my laptop if I'm using a PowerPoint deck. I have a paper printout with the speaker notes next to me. Often if I'm traveling, I will have it on a flash drive so that if my computer goes out and they have a backup computer, we can just reload it onto the backup computer. And I used to do this, but not as much anymore. I used to also load things up to SlideShare so that if all else was failing, I could go onto the internet and reload from SlideShare. I stopped doing that because they changed the formatting a few years back where you couldn't just upload the slides the same way. Their speaker notes were off to the side rather than an integral part of the conversation. So they weren't matching up with what the slides were. You had to look at the script and figure out where you were. And also I was losing the transitions that I value so much. I like a slow fade from one slide to another to create that subliminal sense of flow. And SlideShare didn't allow me to do that. Finally, the last of the 10 tips of the section that I'm quoting from the book I did is relax and conduct yourself as if you were physically in the same place your audience is. So now that gets it back to us. We've been in discussion mode without slides for this entire session. Have you felt like you're part of a discussion sitting in an extended room with other people? Yes or no? Have you in any way felt cheated that there were not slides? Would you have preferred slides? That one looks like it's difficult for at least a couple of people. Go ahead.
Well, I'm taking notes on my computer as well. So some stuff I missed, but I've been thinking, oh, like I'll have the slide later so I can go back. I can go back to it. So
perfect. And the quickest of debriefs of that. She's taking her notes. And that raises the question of multitasking. Everybody thinks that they're great at multitasking or that multitasking is something that's laudable. Let us understand that multitasking at a cognitive level is a myth. Clark Quinn and others who I've been talking to you about have documented the idea that if you're doing cognitive work, you cannot be doing 2 things at the same time. I cannot be talking to you and listening to a radio program. I'm either hearing the words from the radio or I'm hearing your words. When we take that back to a learning situation, we don't often enough think about the fact that when we're taking information in and taking notes, that is a form of multitasking. So while you're writing down your notes, you're not necessarily hearing everything that the person is saying. That's okay as long as you recognize it. As long as you recognize that taking the notes is important because you need something to review, and you may not hear every word that the person said, but you're not going to remember every word the person said anyway. Understand what's there, understand how to use it to your advantage. And most importantly, in a train the trainer setting, let us be aware of the fact that our learners are not thinking about that at the level we're discussing it. And it's worth pointing it out to them and saying, there will be times when you're taking notes and you may miss something. Don't sweat it. The PowerPoint deck's going to be there for you. The speaker notes are there. Or I've got a handout here with the top 5 things I wanted you to learn today. So don't worry about what you didn't get. Focus on what you did get and focus on what you personally need to get out of this session so that you walk away happy and better than you were. Again, that's that whole thing of going under the hood and making people comfortable. I hope that what I'm modeling there helps you to see that. And I hope it takes away some of the concerns you've had, if you've had those at all. It's the same way with having mobile devices, including tablets and cell phones in your learning space or at a conference learning space when you're training people in a conference setting. A lot of people will tweet. I do that a lot. I will live tweet things for a variety of reasons. The first reason I live tweet from a session is so that I have my own notes on Twitter afterwards. Second thing is I try to draw colleagues into the conversation, which sometimes works, and we get people offsite participating in a conversation via Twitter. If the speaker, him or herself, doesn't have access to Twitter, those of us in the audience that understand that this is an okay thing with the presenter, will raise questions being raised on Twitter, or we'll offer comments from somebody out. And again, it's a way of expanding our learning space. It doesn't just have to be the office you're teaching it from or in. It doesn't have to be your room and my room. It can be the whole world. The size of our classrooms these days can be global if we use something effectively like Twitter, or we use other ways of getting messages out from what's coming in a learning session and getting messages back in from the audience out there that add to the conversation. But again, it's a multitasking thing. The time I spend doing those quick tweets, and I use a laptop so I can type more quickly on Twitter than if I were trying to use my thumbs and type out a message, it's going to end up with a bunch of typos. As long as we understand that the multitasking part of that means that we're losing content from the presenter or the facilitator while we're tweeting, but we're okay with that because we can gather it to form later, we're okay, we're good to go. Thoughts on that, on the whole theme of multitasking? Anybody want to challenge that or ask about that? Okay, so we're good on that.
I agree with you on that. That's all I
Thank
have.
you. I'm proud to say in this case, I'm not proud of a lot of things, mind you, but I'm proud to say that comes from experience and from reading a lot of research. I want to instill in you that idea that I'm always open to challenge from you if I say something that doesn't match your experience. But you'll find my answers, I try to either give you something based on research I've read, research I've done, experience I've had that suggests it, with an openness to the idea that even research results can change over a period of time. So what we know today is what we work with today. There's a whole thing of learning styles. That's a great one. I hope we get in. I shouldn't say I hope because I can control this. We will at some point address that whole thing of learning styles as a myth in and of itself. I think I mentioned it earlier, but we'll spend a little more time on it. 10 or 15 years ago, we all were convinced that learning styles was a thing. You had to do something for those people that learn by hearing. You had to do something for those people that learn by doing. And that was dogma for us. People like Ruth Calvin, I think her name is Ruth Calvin. I'll have to look up the name and get that for you. But somebody I really respect who's looked at this a lot, did some research with colleagues and showed that that was a total myth. It depends on how you're presenting stuff. And there are preferences, of course, on the learner's side. But the idea that somebody can only learn by hearing or can only learn by reading, research shows that that isn't as accurate as we thought. And it's not accurate. It's more a preference thing. So we have to be going with the flow and constantly learning new things based on what's out there. But that makes it a fascinating field we're in. Mahasan, you've unmuted. Do you have something?
Oh yeah, maybe I was going to push back a little bit. Just one of the reasons I take notes is because I like trainings. I tend to go to a lot of them, and then I always tell myself I'm going to come back to the materials or notes. And unfortunately, I usually don't because of the time. So I feel like if I'm taking notes, like I'm engaging in some sort of way, that maybe I'll remember more of what I've heard. But I mean, maybe you're right. I'm trying to think. Maybe it hasn't worked the way I thought it. So
that's as far as we can go. I absolutely agree with you. I mean, for the longest time, yeah, I thought my personal preference is I like reading something first, but that's my preference. Again, I've learned since I've paid attention to these people saying, well, that isn't evidence-based decision making. I learned from them that if I listen as well as read, I can learn. If I do something as well as read about it or listen to it, I can learn. But my preference is I want to start with reading because that's where my comfort zone is. So it could be that 10 or 15 years from now, somebody down the road comes and does different research and says, well, the research methods were totally skewed and it didn't work out. But right now, at a peer-reviewed level, this seems to be where we're going in terms of how we understand how the mind works and how we understand how learning takes place. So it's a constant thing. A funny thing for me was I was in a conversation with somebody through a setting where you meet somebody one time and they're supposed to be matched with you based on your set of interests, and you have a conversation for 45 minutes to see what that produces, and you go on to the next thing. And I was with somebody that had been teaching for probably 30 or 40 years. And when the whole thing of learning styles came up, and I said, that's not what evidence is showing, she totally walked all over me and said, well, I've been doing this for 40 years and I know this is the way it works. I thought, well, that's the end of this conversation because she's going to base everything on her 40 years of experience. And I'm going to base it on experience plus what research shows and be open to the change there. So as learning facilitators, I want us to be kind of on that side of being open to things that question our assumptions and make us better, and always focus back on what the learner gets from us. We're getting down to our last few minutes, and I don't want to lose sight of the fact that we do have presentations coming up next week. So let's do one thing here. For anybody who has not yet signed up for a date, and I think I've only got 3 people signed up, tell me whether you want to do a presentation on session 5 or session 6. And remember, this is meant to be 5 minutes or less. You'll probably want your whole 5 minutes. It's meant to be something that's simple. So you want to have one goal and no more than 2 objectives for it. And if you're confused about goals and objectives, go back and look back over the slide deck or watch the session from section 2 about the difference between goals and objectives, or we'll have a little bit of time in the last few minutes for review if you need that. But determine what you want to teach, how you're going to teach it, whether you're going to use lecture or demo or whatever else appeals to you. But for right now, those of you on the call, if you haven't already told me, tell me whether you want session 5 or 6 for your presentation. Okay, I see Mahas in session 6. Let me find the sheet. As you start working well this morning, I know I've got you on here because I've checked you off a couple of times. There we go. So you said 6. And I see somebody else. Laura is in for 6. Am I missing anybody else? So Victor, I think I got you last time around, right? No, I didn't get you down. The dates would be next Tuesday or next Thursday, looking at a calendar. If I'm reading my calendar right, it would either be June 1st or June 3rd. If I'm wrong on that, somebody correct me very quickly. Okay, so Victor on 6. And Angie, that would say June 3rd. Put you on session 6 also. Okay, so not surprisingly, most people are opting for 6. I think we've only got one person that wanted to jump in on session 5. And that helps me again to gauge this. I'll make session 5 more of a thing where we can spend a little time up front on some more things around teaching, training, and learning. Let me look, Laura has to leave early. Thanks for the session. Great having you here. I hope this was helpful, and we'll see you at the next session. So what I'll do then is format this a little bit so that session 5 gives us some more chance for content and discussion as well as a presentation. And I'll probably just come to session 6 without much of an agenda other than people being able to do the presentations and be critiqued. Last 5 minutes, what did we not cover today that would be most useful to you, including, does anybody need a review of goals versus objectives? Victor.
I'm going to go ahead and watch the second part of the recording
Okay.
where you're addressing that, just because I also need to leave in a few minutes.
Okay. Quick form of it is goals. In this case, your goal. It's the big dreamy thing you want to accomplish. Like, I want somebody to be able to use a self-checkout machine. I want somebody to be able to come in and find 5 books that help them in their research. I want somebody to find something on a health issue that is important to them. Then your objective is you actually measure it by saying they found 5 books or they found 3 great resources on what cancer means and what treatments are available to them. So with your goal, think big, the transformation you want to see. With your objective, think about the thing you can actually measure that shows the transformation was completed successfully. Does that help?
Yeah, it does.
That's a half-hour lecture condensed into 1 minute. I've actually gotten quite good at that, having seen people struggle with it. Good. Angie, any questions from you or observations?
No questions.
All right, well, I'm not one of those people that thinks I have to hold you just to the top of the hour, just to hold you to the top of the hour. So if you have no more questions, feel free to go. What I'll do in about 5 seconds is end the recording for those that are watching it. If either of you want to stay for any post-recorded comments, feel free to do that. But thanks for the session, and I'll see you on Thursday when we continue looking at how to deliver and how to evaluate. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Paul.